Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Booker, Vice President for Scholarly Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's panel. This is the first event in the Center's Restoring Our Vitality series, which we are presenting in partnership with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Academy's landmark report on the humanities and social sciences, The Heart of the Matter. As the series unfolds over the next few weeks, we will be delving into some of the challenges facing humanists and humanities institutions. And as we ponder those challenges, we will also be considering the role the humanities should play in building more innovative and resilient communities in the future. For today's panel, we will be starting from inside the academic world and discussing how institutions of higher education might reimagine how faculty are recognized and rewarded, given the increasing importance of public scholarship, collaborative research, and new interdisciplinary models that have arisen in recent years. I'm delighted to be joined for this conversation by three distinguished panelists: Karita Brown from Emory University, Jeffrey Cohen from Arizona State University, and Elie Wood from the Huntington. In the interest of time, I'm going to very briefly introduce each of them and then ask them to make a few remarks before we proceed to a general conversation. Our first presenter, Karita Brown, is professor of sociology at Emory University, where her research centers on the ontologies of systemic racism and the fullness of Black life. Dr. Brown's work combines her expertise in data-driven social science research, her experience in navigating complex global organizations, and her love of the arts to bring actionable and reparative knowledge to the public. She is the author of 2 scholarly books and currently serves on the board of the Obama Presidency Oral History Project and serves as the inaugural director of the Los Angeles Lakers Oral History and Racial Justice Project, creating a first-of-its-kind archive focused on the professional basketball team from a social justice view. Also joining us is Jeffrey Cohen, Dean of Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. A scholar of medieval and early modern literature, Jeffrey's scholarship has focused on things that challenge the imagination, and he is widely published in the fields of medieval studies, monster theory, post-humanism, and eco-criticism. At ASU, Professor Cohen is focused on building on the university's strengths in environmental humanities, increasing opportunities for the humanities scholars to reach wider publics, and ensuring greater diversity among the next generation of scholars, teachers, and researchers. Finally, we are delighted to have Elie Wood with us. She is the Nadine and Robert A. Skotheim Director of Education and Public Programs and leads institutional efforts in lifelong learning and community engagement at the Huntington. Previously, she held several positions at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis as Associate Dean for Student Affairs, Chair of the Museum Studies Program, and Professor of Museum Studies and Education. She also served as Public Scholar of Museums, Families, and Learning at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. Elie is the former editor of the journal Museums and Social Issues and a member of the collaborative Active Collections, which aims to generate thought and action within American museums to better connect American museum visitors to museum collections. Welcome, all of you. We will start with short comments from each of you and then move into a more general discussion. For those of you who are viewing on YouTube, you may enable closed captions directly from YouTube. And please feel free to enter questions or comments in the chat at any time. Karita, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Matthew, for that beautiful introduction. And I really want to thank the National Humanities Center for hosting this urgent and very important panel discussion and inviting me to be a part of it. So today I'm just going to make a few remarks that come from my own lived experience as a public scholar whose research is and has always been rooted in communities. So even before starting on the tenure track, back in graduate school, my research was always, always had one leg in the community, always had a public and or artistic arm to it. Starting with my own dissertation research that centered oral history methodology as the central mode of inquiry for my study. Now, to my humanities friends in the audience, that might not sound like anything too out of the ordinary, but I can promise you, as a sociologist, that was really, let's call it an uphill battle to even legitimize the method. In doing so, I quickly realized that the data that I was collecting, these oral histories, and in my case, I was studying African Americans who had grown up in small company-owned coal mining towns in Appalachia back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So this was an elderly population at the time of the interviews. I understood what that meant. I understood that these were very rare sources of not only regional, but American history. And I quickly understood that the scholarship should not just be for my own publication. This should be a public good. And that started me on the road of exploring how to make my data more publicly available, and also how to view the research that I was doing, move it out of a more individualistic frame into, understanding myself as a part of the collective. That opened to me the world of archives, because I knew that I immediately had to find a home for this body of oral history interviews. This project culminated into what is now called the Eastern Kentucky African American Migration Project. It is housed at UNC Chapel Hill at the Southern Historical Collection in the Wilson Library. That library is the gold standard for collecting materials related to the American South. So it was the most appropriate place for that body of oral histories, but even more so, at that very time, the administration at that library were open to dipping their toe into what we call now community-driven archives. The eCamp project was one of the very first community-driven archives to be constituted at the Southern Historical Collection, and we learned together. And when I say we, that means me as the researcher, the group of archivists and administrators that run that very fine institution, and also the 153 living families who were sharing their life stories and trusting us to do good by them, to respect their wishes, but also make sure that they had a seat at the table in how we were going through the decision-making process of constituting that archive. So that's me cutting my teeth in public scholarship during graduate school. And because of the choices that I'd made, yes, I was doing all the right things. I was publishing in peer-reviewed academic journals and going to conferences. But because I had this other weird arm to my scholarship that I didn't yet know how to articulate and didn't quite see a model for, at least in my discipline, I didn't know what to do with that. And I didn't know if that would then preclude me from academic job opportunities. Would I be seen as a serious scholar? But I just couldn't stop. So then I went on to co-create 3 exhibitions out of the eCamp archive using that oral history material. And also, my research participants are fantastic. They started to also send in materials to that community-driven archive. And I mean, to the tune of over 10,000 photographs, okay? A wedding dress, a hot comb. We've got documents galore in that eCamp archive, so we began to exhibit it along with the oral history interviews. But I ask you all in the audience, how do you count that on a tenure dossier? what do you do with that, and who evaluates the quality of that work or the impact? I was fortunate in that I did, right after graduate school, secure an appointment at UCLA in the Department of Sociology. They did recognize my scholarship, and they were very excited about the work that I was doing. We didn't quite have a name for it, and there wasn't yet a section in my review dossiers, to really describe it. But nonetheless, they were very, very supportive at that institution, and I am ever grateful for that department for embracing me in that way. But yet and still, what do you do with that? Because of the work that I did with eCamp, I was early into my tenure track appointed as onto the advisory board for the Obama Presidency Oral History Project, which is going to be a part of the Presidential Library through the Obama Foundation. At the time, I was the only assistant professor appointed onto this board. There are over 30 world-renowned, phenomenal scholars, journalists, presidential historians, and what have you on that board. And they also included me. That was the first time that I really began to realize the legitimacy of that public and community scholarship that I was doing, beyond a commitment of a moral imperative that I hold and continue to hold, but something that had academic value. Okay, so that was a turning point for me. And while I got congratulations emails from my colleagues, which I really appreciated at UCLA, that was about the extent of it. And again, how do you measure that in the tenure and promotion process? So again, I found myself feeling like I was living two lives, and one I kind of had to keep hidden away and just like, don't talk about it. It's fine to do it, but just don't be expecting any kind of recognition beyond a pat on the back for that. Okay, so now let's fast forward nearing up to 2020. The COVID pandemic has started. We are all shut down, locked in our houses. And let's say this is like March 2020, when we have no idea, is this going to be a 1 week kind of thing, or are we in this for the long haul when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic? This so happened to be exactly the time when my tenure dossier was due. Can you imagine? So I'm writing my statement under the duress, not only of a global health pandemic, but also under the duress of a racial reckoning that we all had to sit with, individually, physically isolated, but collectively distressed in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. That was a watershed moment for me, because I started to question, did my scholarship even matter? Like, I think I'm doing community work, but it's not helping. What is it stopping, So I'm having all of those existential questions hit me all at the same time, in isolation, while my tenure materials are due. And then I got an email. Actually, my whole department got an email. It was very cryptic, and the chair of the department at the time just said, an organization is looking for a scholar who has an expertise in systemic racism to come do a lunch and learn with them. Is anybody interested? And when I saw that email, it was like, it saved my life in many ways, because I was just really not in a good place, okay? And I needed to know that I could contribute something good to the world with my expertise. And here goes this company that wants to do this lunch and learn. So I responded in maybe 30 seconds and said, I'll do it. And the chair wrote me back privately and said, okay, it's the Los Angeles Lakers, and can you come spend time with them tomorrow? After that lunch and learn, which was supposed to be 30 minutes, it turned into a little over an hour with the entire staff. So that is a company that's just shy of 200 employees. Everybody was on the call, from the owner and the president to the people who keep the lights on in the buildings. And it was just a moment to process and share with one another. The next day, I received an email from the president of business operations from the Los Angeles Lakers. The title of that email was "Your New Second Job." And from there on, I joined the organization in 2020 as the company's inaugural director of racial equity in action. Now, I came on in a temporary role to help them build a playbook for how to transition from a non-racist organization to an anti-racist organization. And I stayed with the company for 2 years doing that work while also doing my scholarship and teaching and doing, so all of that's happening and pandemicking. So it was a whirlwind of a time, but time and time again, what I began to see was there is a not only legitimacy in that public and community scholarship, but my institution, my academic home, must find a way to capture the value and communicate that and legitimize that for faculty. So that became something that became a huge advocate for. Now I have moved on. My appointment is at Emory University, where I am professor of sociology. I must say, and humble brag, I did earn tenure at UCLA. In fact, because of, and I hope this contributes to the topic of the conversation, I don't know because I wasn't allowed to be in the meeting, right? But I suspect with the way that the case was handled, all of these conundrums that I was dealing with over the years about how does this fit? How do we evaluate? What weight do we associate with it? That became the conundrum for the Tenure and Promotion Committee and the department as well. And at the end of the day, what UCLA ended up doing, the Department of Sociology ended up advocating for, was to promote me from assistant to full. And that, I think, hadn't happened in UCLA history in the last 25 years. So with that, what seems like a victory, and I do feel very proud of that, good about that, I think it's also a cautionary tale about how we must expand our thinking around, how public scholarship and the impact that we must make as scholars not only should be valued, not only should be counted, not just for an individual promotion, right? I mean, we all need to sustain ourselves with our jobs and our lives and what have you, but I'm a bit idealistic in that I do believe that the life of an academic, we are a public good. We do serve a moral purpose in the world. And if we are not incentivized is probably the strong word, but if we're not encouraged to be out in the world, to be the change we want to see, then I think that we do a disservice not only to ourselves as academics and professionals, we do a disservice to our institutions, but we also opt out of having a seat at the table for change. And that is unacceptable. So I'll close with that. Really look forward to hearing from my co-panelist and to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Karita. That is much to think with as we get into the questions section of this conversation. Jeffrey, I'd like to turn over the microphone to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me here. And Karita, that was so powerful. And I think that really that sums up the importance of what we're talking about here. And it's really affirming to hear that you had a good outcome, because we've all heard the stories of those who've struggled and have not found the way to have their work valued. Kudos to you. You're amazing. I have to say, it's an honor to be on this panel with you. So I'm at Arizona State University. I'm the Dean of Humanities here. We're a large state university. I have about 360 full-time faculty in the Humanities division alone. One of the reasons I chose to become an administrator here is I'm really compelled by the ASU charter. Not every university has a charter and has a mission. I'm going to read it to you because you'll see why, to my mind, public humanities and public practice of what we do should be baked into everything an educational institution does. But here's the ASU charter. It's very short. ASU is a comprehensive public research university measured not by whom it excludes, but by whom it includes and how they succeed, advancing research and discovery of public value, and assuming fundamental responsibility for the economic, social, cultural, and overall health of the communities it serves. That is not knowledge in the abstract. That is not, go off and research whatever arcane thing compels you. It's also make it relevant to the world that we're living in, and always disseminate your work in a way that interacts with the communities, knowing that our purpose here is the betterment of our students, of the world, of all those whom we serve. So having said that, I was a little surprised. I'll just tell you recently, something that happened in our English department, my reaction to it in the larger conversation that we're having at the moment. We're right now retooling our graduate program in English. And we had a surprising comment made among the faculty there that I heard about later. When many of the people that work here do public work, that's what drew them here because of their charter. But somebody during a discussion called public humanities work a hobby and talked about why we would want to train our students to do something that's a hobby. Now, as you can imagine, there was an immediate reaction against it, and it led to a very good discussion about how we value public work here. Actually became a big discussion on the internet as well because a tweet went out on that one. But I just reminded our faculty of the charter, of the fact that ASU is a public enterprise, and also the fact that if we are, on the one hand, going to argue that our educational system in the United States could be better, and yet on the other hand, try to make it simply for those already inside it, then what good are we accomplishing? That is, if we're producing knowledge and we're not sharing it, then something is really wrong with our elitism. To me, public humanities is just simply the practice of what we can and should do. It's based on communications. I, in my own work, despite being a medievalist, which seems as arcane as it could possibly be, have always thought of myself as a medievalist and an activist, meaning that I don't study the past because I'm interested in the past on its own terms. I'm interested in studying the past because I want us to have better futures. And a lot of what propels my work and the work of many of those who I work with is that we turn to the past in order to get back some of the knowledge that we used to have, and very often in our own arrogance feel like we've superseded it. We turn to the past to tell better stories that help us frame the kinds of worlds that we want to bring about. I encourage my faculty to do the same. We try to build a reward system around it. One of the major initiatives that we just launched, I'm very excited to go to it tonight, is a world building initiative where we invite any member of the community to come and imagine, using all the tools in the humanities toolbox, what another world would look like, up from building its language, its history, its culture, its mores, which really means, study linguistics, study anthropology a bit, study history, study how to create an archive, study cartography. And the idea is, if you can create something better using the tools of the imagination, which is something humans have been doing over time, it would give you a better idea of the more just future that we might move towards together. So these kinds of public and communalizing acts, I think, should be baked into everything that we do. I will say this, it's easiest to reward our faculty, especially for doing it as an extension of their teaching. Because the reward system for teaching is really clear. If you include public outreach and public projects and public histories as part of what you're doing, not only does it make your students really far more engaged and more successful, it also gives you something to brag about when it comes to your teaching and probably when it comes to your service as well. It's a little more challenging when it comes to our promotion and tenure process. I'm asking our humanities units here to think in their bylaws about how they can better recognize and value the public work that our faculty do. It has not been done yet, meaning that we have many statements of that we do value public work, but we don't really have mechanisms to capture it, especially as part of the promotion and tenure process. I would say it's actually easier at the promotion to full process when a lot of what you do is the demonstration of the impact of your work. That seems straightforward. All your public work counts. But when it comes to promotion and tenure, I think most institutions, I was going to say in the United States, but I think this is actually worldwide, tend to go back to the way that we've always done things, tend still to praise the monograph, the specialized book, tend still to get scholars who are at, bright and shiny institutions to write letters that will praise the junior scholar. And there's a certain kind of conservatism that gets inbuilt into the system as a result of that. And what would happen, for example, if we invited community members to also write letters for scholars, should they choose to have community members participate? What would happen if we enabled to have impact statements and other ways to measure the work that's been done? I was really inspired recently when Jim Grossman, the executive director of the AHA, wrote about for guidelines for broadening the definition of what constitutes scholarship, gave an array of different kinds of things that we might look at. And even in the course of his conversations over what that looks like, he had to admit he doesn't necessarily know how to evaluate like a historian's contribution to video games. What would that be? It would be something. It's a way of reaching a lot of audiences. And I have to say, just because we don't know how to value it doesn't mean that we shouldn't value it. It means we should figure out how to value it. And very often that just means getting the expert in the room that gives the advice that's going to allow the case to get the context that it needs in order to be effective, because even if, say, a department is all in, that doesn't mean the next level will be all in. When it's often a college level decision-making unit and then moving up to a university decision-making unit and a president, how do we ensure that the cases are well informed from the moment that they're put together and judged, and that baked into it are the voices that actually can value that work, so that you don't get the occasional person who just hasn't yet caught up with where many of our fields are going. The one other thing that I'll say about this, because I think about this a lot, I don't think it's only about advancing our scholars. It is about that. That's really important. I don't think it's only about changing the kinds of work our graduate students do. Again, it is, but it's not only that. I think the piece that often gets left out, especially at a moment when we got so in the habit of talking about the crisis in the humanities, and the answer to solving the crisis in the humanities is right in front of us. Do public work. It's what our students want us to do. Our students don't necessarily even recognize that there's a discipline called humanities. They don't necessarily even care about it, but they want to do work that has importance in the world. And if, as part of our practice of the disciplines that we still continue to call by their old-fashioned names like English and history and philosophy, if within the possibilities of those disciplines, we enable our students to do things that have impact in the world and we show them the way through our own work, I don't think we'll be worrying about enrollments anymore. I don't think we'll be worrying about our own relevance anymore. So it does seem to me that the answers are already there. People like Karita have already given them to us. It's a powerful model. And I think the missing piece has been having a clear university mechanism for valuing. That is, it's not fair to the scholars who dedicate their lives to doing this public work to also have the onus on them to ensure that their work is valued. That is the obligation of the institutions, not of the scholars. So I welcome everyone else's thought. I'm pretty passionate on this, but I admit change is far harder and it is slower than I would have expected it to be.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Also food for thought for our conversation to come. Elie, I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries. Thank you all, Karida and Jeffrey. I love you to death, and we've only known each other for 15, 20, 30 minutes today. I feel like I have a lot of answers to some of the questions that you're asking, or if I have experienced some things in some different ways. So I'll try to give, just kind of give a little bit of the history of how I ended up where I am. I'm kind of a little bit sad I'm not in the academic settings anymore. Maybe not a little bit, but I have worked in and outside of universities and museums for most of my career. So I tend to kind of go back and forth between the two. And I think that sometimes the reality check of working in another world, museums are not necessarily also seen as hyper relevant. So it's a similar conversation. But I think the opportunity to go back and forth between community settings where the application of knowledge comes into play is actually really valuable for me in terms of how I start to think about my work. So in my current position as the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Huntington, our goal is really to help public audiences connect with our collections and the research that's happening here. So I need to be working with scholars to help them see, here's the reality of the application, here's the exhibition, here's where, these are the people who will read your book if it goes into more popular circulation. And in the same way that Karita said she has one leg in the community, I like to use Miles Horton's quote about being a two-eyed educator, looking at where people are at and what they need, but then also what's possible for them to become. And I think that has always been the way that I think about my role as a faculty member at working in museums. However I want to do that is really being able to see multiple possibilities about work that has dual purpose or value across multiple areas. And I think a lot of that comes from my own interest in having things to be useful and applied. I'm extremely practical, but yet I also have my head in the clouds all the time. Head in the clouds, feet on the ground simultaneously. I'm rabidly curious. I always want to know, how did this come to be? But that's that curiosity-driven research that drives the humanities. And I think being able to continue to support that in public audiences is how we continue to build on that need. So my story starts by taking on this ambitious position at IUPUI that was a tenure track position that was called Public Scholar of Civic Engagement, with a specific focus on museums, families, and learning. And on top of that, it was a joint appointment in 2 schools plus a community partner. No one had ever done this before. I don't think anybody had any clue what they were going to do in order to count my work or to establish any of this sort of like, how do we even evaluate that? But the purpose of that at the time, and so this was in the mid-2000s, was part of the institution's civically engaged emphasis and really looking at how they would create positions to do civically engaged research as the primary focus. Co-production of knowledge. And I think that's really where that public scholarship comes into play. And Karita, you gave such beautiful examples of that. It's shared, it's mutual, it's beneficial to each other. And I think that comes from goals that come from the scholar and the community. It's never one or the other. Sometimes it can be driven, one or the other can start it, but it has to be mutual. I think that's really important. And thinking about this, I got tenure in this role as a public scholar. I worked very hard to communicate with people to help build this. And that momentum at IUPUI, especially during that time, really generated a lot of campus-wide support and continued development of these. I was part of a faculty community on developing guidelines for public scholarship at IUPUI to be kind of implemented campus-wide. I was the first person to test them out and get promoted to full professor using specific guidelines for publicly engaged scholarship. And what's really important about that is that these guidelines that we articulated were really focused on a lot of these same questions that we've raised already. Who evaluates? How is it relevant? How are you defining these things? How is the community involved? How are they part of this process? So some of the key things that I think came out of those criteria are actually in the Heart of the Matter report as well, which is really important to recognize that it's about knowing the needs and interests of those audiences. If you don't know what people need, how is it that your work can be relevant? How do you involve different communities in shaping the needs and directions? That is, again, where the public value comes into play. And I think the question here then also becomes, how are you defining publics and how are you defining communities? And they have to be broad, they have to be wide, they have to be thoughtful in terms of where you're at and what's happening. And so I think that in and of itself also becomes very complicated. In my position as public scholar at Indianapolis, at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, I was working with that staff to figure out how to do research that would help them be more powerful learning place for their community and their public. So I was sort of in an intermediary role. And a lot of the time, the things that they were interested in might not have been something that I thought was, wasn't my area of expertise. How could I possibly do this? But in fact, as I developed the relationships, which are cornerstone to this work, it's really about understanding how will people need to use this? What will help them be better? And I think I've heard this actually now from Karida and Jeffrey as well, is that it's really about the mindset of the scholar and their identity. And that's what makes this work. And I kind of see that as a little bit, you have to come to this job with some epistemological humility, that no way of knowing is better than one another. They're all equally important and valuable. And you have to find that middle ground to share ideas. And that's what makes us all better. But I think the other part of that is that recognizing these different ways of knowing is also a fundamental aspect of being able to appreciate diversity, inclusion, different ways of knowing, how you are supporting communities and needs. And that really comes into play in all of this. I think it's a subtext that we don't talk about a lot, but I think it's really important to begin to think through. There's lots of different things that I could go into, and I want to make sure we have good time for questions. I think the key is that doing public work is not just service. And I think that within the academy, service is a very different kind of thing. I think public scholarship still relies on rigor. It still relies on systematic processes. It still relies on preparation. I think it still relies on outputs in terms of where's it going to make the most sense, where's it going to make the most impact. Sometimes you get both. That's also okay. I think it's really key then in thinking about how you are connecting those pieces together and how you're able to demonstrate that your question evolved from a collaborative process or a need in the community or something to that end. And that then you can value the input from those community members. I was thoughtful because I come from my educational background. I come from I have an evaluation studies kind of experience. And so I used a lot of that knowledge and work in audience research to help develop some strategies to capture the value of this material for different groups of people. And so that was something that I was able to incorporate into my dossier as I was going through the promotion process. We also included very intentionally letters from community members and asked them to speak to key specific points that were part of these criteria. So again, when you're working across this and sort of looking at evaluating and counting and all of those kinds of things, you have to think about them differently. You have to think about how you are walking across these worlds and crossing boundaries and working on the edges and the fringes, and how you're helping people translate from one thing to the next. And I think that's where, again, people who have this mindset already know how to do that, because that's why we're doing it in the first place. So it was a little bit of a ramble, but I think it's sort of first to catch all of these key questions around why we're doing this shouldn't be about ourselves. It should be about the greater good and the bigger whole, because that's part of what, what we're all here to do, is to figure out who we are in the world and why we matter and what we can do to make a difference. And I think people who are doing public work usually are doing double duty, and they need to be recognized for that. And Karita, congrats to you for skipping over that middle that middle part of the promotion. I think it's really key, and having had to mentor other faculty coming up behind me, it was really important for me to recognize how I was leaving behind material that could be supportive of them as well. And I think that's another aspect of it. But I'll just leave it at that.
Gosh, what a wonderful set of comments, and thank you, Elie, for bringing together, as I also saw these threads in the three of your comments. So we have a handful of questions here, and I would love to have, I'm going to introduce one of them, but I would love to have you the three of you really riff on this as you wish and engage with one another beyond simply the question I ask. So I too was picking up, Elie, on the sort of elements of repetition or maybe different perspectives that the three of you bring to a couple of themes. Karida, you said, how do you count? How do you measure? Which is this core question when it comes to, to getting tenure and to giving it for institutions. Jeffrey, you pointed out that it might be easier to evaluate public scholarship, or at least to honor it, at the level of promotion to full, because there we are often measuring impact of scholarship as opposed to the initial contribution of expertise, staking out your turf, so to speak. And Elie, you use this wonderful phrase of epistemological humility. And all of those come together, I suppose, in this contract, this conflict with expertise, with scholars as experts, right? Because Elie, what you're calling for, in fact, what all three of you are calling for, is to facilitate others, to collaborate, to work with, to bring up, to serve. And you're focused, I think, on utility rather than expertise, on advancing, on co-production, as you put it, Elie. So I guess I would ask you to discuss, is there in fact a conflict between this expertise that we have established through the sole authored monograph, through the individual contribution that we easily write about in tenure letters, and this notion of public scholarship? Is there a way to square this circle?
That's a really hard way to start. I'm just going to dip my toe in the water here for a second to say, not that we have to compare ourselves with the sciences, but it's interesting how you look at the concept of team science that has started to become more, a little bit more prevalent, has been around for a very long time. And I think there are certain fields of study where working together and collaboratively is just the way you work. My undergraduate degree is in theater. And so I have always thought of the process as being one of collaborative work where multiple people have a role that come together. But humanities work is very different because I think it does come often from that curiosity, the nugget of the question that the person has that they want to pursue. And I think, Jeffrey, you kind of mentioned this a little bit in terms of being a medievalist who wants to use the past to make the future better. That there's got to be other people involved in your thinking in that. And I think that kind of comes back to some of the things that we're all talking about, is that the three of us are all coming into this not as like it's just my show. We're thinking about a lot of other people that are with us, whether immediately or not. And I think that is a really important distinction.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head. And Karita, I think you answered this when you talked about how it's not just scholarship, it's a public good. And a public good can't belong to a single person or a single scholar. And I think one of the ways that we went wrong is to make the scholar into a hero, as if the successful scholar is the solitary scholar, the person who works really hard against all the odds in the lonely archive or whatever. I mean, come on. I'm sure that is that's a perfectly fine model, but I think we need other models, including more collaborative models, team-based models. We gotten to the point where we know that team teaching isn't 50% of the effort. It's, for those of us who've done it, it's about twice as much work as when you teach by yourself. The same with scholarship. It's not 50% of effort. If you're really working with someone, you put a lot more effort into it. So we need reward systems that acknowledge it's not about heroic individuals. It's about doing work with wide publics. And Karita, your example of working with the Lakers, for example. I'm going to show my Phoenix Suns mug here. Lakers not my favorite team, but we do a lot of work here in sport humanities at ASU. And what I really love and have learned so much from my colleagues in sport humanities is that you're part of a team. You are never the person who's just going off and doing it by yourself. And your team includes your students, your collaborators, the team that you're working with, the fans. I think those widened ways of measuring impact really matter.
I can't agree more with you, Jeffrey and Elie. So I won't say much more about this besides just emphasizing that that term about the collective good, the public good, vis-a-vis the individualism that's baked into the cake of the current reward system at most institutions. It is important for me as the sociologist in the room to also just, say the thing that we all know, which is that the tenure and promotion process is an exclusionary process. It is a process that is that maintains certain boundaries and also reproduces and rewards certain types of scholars and scholarship and excludes others or makes it illegible or invisible the contributions of types of scholarship or scholars that don't fit into that not only a predetermined structure, but one that has 150-year legacy, right? So there's a structural element there that's doing that exclusion and constraining work that is very anti the collective, that is anti the public good ideal, yet and still we try to, it's kind of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by finding a way to fit this conversation and this evaluative process of evaluating public scholarship into the, archaic model of tenure and promotion at university. So I raised that not as an answer, but a part of the bigger problem that we're really talking about and the conditions within which we're all thinking through this issue.
And I just want to add one little word to that, because I think, again, that's exactly right. You said it so well. And it's not just tenure and promotion. Tenure and promotion is another symptom of educational institutions who love their exclusivity. Think about how many of us work at institutions that brag about the number of students that they reject in a given year. Highly selective, because we told 97% of the students who applied here, yeah, no, this isn't the place for you. I mean, how do we, if an institution is based on bragging about its own exclusions for the sake of meritocracy, I think we've got a lot that we really have to reckon with as far as institutions go. What happens when we open the doors wider? What happens when we're more welcoming? And I think it's, changing what we think of a scholar or academic expert being is the beginning of a process of opening up what educational institutions can do. I'm certain of that.
I think just to sort of thinking through this thread about this awareness of different disciplines, I think is where some of this challenge comes back. And I know you were mentioning sort of changing the names of disciplines. I'm all for that. I think I'm an interdisciplinary person. But, thinking about the professional associations that have taken this on, I know that is where a lot of benefit can come. The National Council on Public History, for example, is a really great professional association that is both scholars and practitioners who have worked to define within their field criteria for public work. I'm sure there are others, they're the ones that I'm most familiar with, but the more that our own professional associations are able to define this, that's additional backup, because there are definitely, I'm not going to point out any fingers, but there are certainly the departments that live very much in that sort of highly traditional, what value could possibly come if you talk to someone else mindset, which is really detrimental, I think, in the bigger picture of understanding the broader world and where things come from and how they work and why they matter.
We have stepped into acknowledging and discussing and decrying the need for a moment here, and I think that's totally fair, and that's what many of our audience think about too. On the other hand, what's really special about you three, to me, and the reason I was so pleased that you accepted my invitation to speak, is that each of you has made positive contributions to actually resolving some of these crises. And our audience members are calling us on it. So one of our audience members on YouTube said he would love some additional details about sample criteria that you have seen used effectively for evaluating public work in tenure and promotion cases. And he also says, thanks for the great panel. The follow-up is, are there resources you would recommend folks consider in terms of understanding the best practices for evaluating publicly engaged work? Elie, I think you just gave us the National Council of Public History as one. The American Historical Association, as Jeffrey noted, has also put out some ideas, and I think the Modern Languages Association as well. So any sample criteria the three of you could recommend for evaluating public work in tenure and promotion cases? Give us the good news.
I put in the chat, so hopefully Jackie or Sarah, you can share that back out. There's a link to the criteria that we used at IUPUI. That is part of their open tenure and promotion resources for campus. There is actually also a review, sort of like a coaching committee, I think, now that they've established. Imagining America is another really great resource that has several position papers and publications on work related to scholarship and public life. I'm trying to find a good example there, but those are three really good ones that shaped my thinking a lot.
And I would simply point out that we are decades into the revolution in scholarship that public humanities, digital humanities, you name it, launched. Our professional organizations have been offering all kinds of advice for a long time. I think what's kind of astonishing is that the word travels so slowly, meaning that the resources are out there. But I cannot think of a model set of bylaws that I would offer from one single institution where they got it exactly right. Part of it too is that our colleagues within the field have thought deeply about this. Communicating that value up to people outside of the field, which is what happens during the promotion and tenure process, is I think where everybody worries. And then that becomes the brake on change, especially for promotion and tenure, because we want to maximize the chances that our junior colleagues become our senior colleagues. And so we get scared to fiddle with the system at all. But again, I would really say this is a long conversation. It's just that it shows how conservative academic institutions are, that the knowledge that we've had for a long time hasn't really penetrated into a change how we evaluate scholarship.
I do not have contemporary examples, but I do also want to add in, let us not forget about our academic ancestors. So for example, I am a Du Boisian scholar, and when I look back to the origins of my discipline of sociology, Du Bois was a sociologist, but he was never just sitting in his office penning his 26 books and thousands of articles. He was also editing the Crisis magazine for the NAACP, making sure that he re-articulated his sociological understandings of the race issue, not only in the US and the world, and getting that out to the masses, starting a public conversation, okay? Getting involved in organizations, and not only from the position of being a founder and a leader, you don't always have to be the one in front. What does it mean to just be a part of a community? And I take those examples from the scholars and academics that were around in the early years of our respective disciplines, when there were no subfields, when our academic institutions weren't yet corporations, when these boundaries were much more blurred around what the role of a professor and an academician really was to the public. And that's where I started to piece together at least my wish list, or my ideal about, I see academics as these public superheroes. We belong to the public. And I got that idea for looking at what Du Bois did. He belonged to everyone. And that is the type of scholarship that I want to do. But that is also the type of scholarship that I expect my institution, my discipline, and my field to recognize, acknowledge, and reward.
That's so powerful. And that also gets at the fact that I think picking up on the very tradition that you're talking about. So we're lucky to have someone like Elizabeth Alexander in charge of the Mellon Foundation. The Mellon Foundation is not the same place anymore, and it is funding exactly those kinds of projects that you talk about that are out in the community. But it took visionary leadership of someone who gets that you need to be engaged with communities before you could see that funding. And then now that projects get funded, I would say ACLS is also on top of it, Joy Connolly and her team, getting us to rethink the parameters of what constitute work that should be valued and helping us to rethink how to value it. But once our faculty get the kinds of rewards from places like Mellon or Luce or Templeton or you name it, well, that's easy to value because that's grant money coming in. So I think foundations are actually helping to push us towards some of that institutional change.
I think it's interesting too to think about it from the standpoint of, and this has come up a little bit, is that we're not trying to reproduce ourselves to reproduce the academy. We really should be trying to produce knowledge that's of value to the public. And I think that comes through, especially in places that public universities that have kind of come out of the land grant system for whatever good and ill that you can see there. But I think sometimes the challenge comes from the perception that applied work or practical research is not the same as something that's sort of very highly esoteric or sort of very deeply conceptual or something like that. When, knowledge is about making our lives better, about understanding the world, about seeing how we can be who we are. And I think when we don't have places that value that in and of themselves, that's where we start to run into trouble. That sort of, when I first proposed my dissertation, I had a faculty member who was like, oh, well, that's very esoteric. Surely you're going to come up with something better, which is interesting because that was sort of looking at it from a completely different side, that it was not, he couldn't see where the utility was. So it's interesting across different fields, what is useful knowledge and what is not useful knowledge, and whether or not where that fits. I don't know where that goes, because it's really interesting across our three disciplinary areas, the intent or the sort of, my background is in education, so it's very clearly got a purpose. Sometimes it's an interesting question to think about. When I was dean of students and the parents would come in and say, well, I don't know, what good is it for my students to be a history major? What are they going to do? But that's where it does come back around to how you think, how you know, what you do, how you see relevance, how you find value.
Here's a question from, well, first, I wanted to say thank you to Karita also for reminding us that our institutions and our tenure reward system and our, what counts as being a successful academic was not always thus, that there were other models in early years that the flexibility and the way to even to fame has changed over time. And I think this speaks to Jeffrey's comment about a conservatism that has crept in, that perhaps there was an earlier time when our tenure and academic reward systems were more flexible than they are now, and it might be worth recovering that. Here's a question that our Director of Public Engagement, Jackie Kellish, crafted, and it's one I particularly like. She asks about another arena of public scholarship or of public contribution, which is diversity, equity, inclusivity on campus communities and beyond. And Karita, this goes directly to some of the extraordinary pain and also desire we all felt. I hope all of us felt. I think we all felt during the terrible pandemic years when we were also struggling with this long overdue and still pending racial reckoning that you refer to. So she asks, how, if at all, has institutional recognition of faculty contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusivity on campus communities been rewarded in our academic reward system? And perhaps this is the real question for the three of you. What are some ways we can imagine the academic reward system shifting to pay attention and to honor that kind of work, which I think falls into that bucket we often call service, but really is often also a scholarly contribution, a form of public work?
Such an important question. And if I were responding to that in 2020 or even 2021, my response would be completely different. But we find ourselves here today in a moment where we've got, last time I checked, 13 states that have adopted some form of a stop woke legislation that makes it illegal, criminally actionable for teachers at public institutions to even take those steps to making their curricula more inclusive, let alone taking direct action in the systemic, structural, institutional, and policy changes that must happen to level a playing field. When we are talking about the equity piece of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not to bring this back to basketball, but I gotta bring this back to basketball. Just think of a basketball court. We need a level playing field to be able to know that everybody got a fair shot at the game. We're not all gonna have the same outcomes. So we're not talking about equal outcomes guaranteed for everybody. That's just not the system. But what we can do is put the nuts and bolts in place to create those equitable structures. And I find myself deeply concerned, in a deep state of woe, that from a federal and state legislative perspective, a lot of that action and work is deeply constrained and held up in a political sphere where that makes that question, the answer is different based on what zip code you're in. And that is deeply troubling to our democracy.
That's a really powerful warning about the changes that are happening at the state level and that are spreading when it comes to limiting what we can and cannot say in classrooms, not just in colleges, but high schools, elementary schools. There's a real chilling effect that's going on, and we've got to mobilize against that effect because so much of it is based on ignorance. The way I think about it is, I'm an administrator at a Hispanic serving institution. ASU has 2,200 tribal students. They represent the 22 tribes of Arizona, as well as most of the ones across the US. 40% of our students are first generation. The majority of those are students of color. if we are not enabling their success, then we have fundamentally failed. So we have to value in everything we do, whether it's scholarship or service or teaching, the DEI principles of inclusion, right? Equity. We want the outcomes to be undifferentiated, no matter where you've arrived from in college. Another way to put this is, I'm really amazed at the ASU students, but one thing that we have, for example, an amazing honors college here where I've met some of the smartest students I've ever worked with. But having said that, the students who are not in the honors college are just as good. It's just they didn't start from the same place. So we need everything in place to make sure that every student has what they need in order to succeed. And part of that puts the mission on our own faculty to enable them to find the ways that help them to intersect with our students' interests. And when you do that, I think all of everything that we like to label into a category DEI as if it were separate from others becomes just, the very fabric of all of what we're doing.
I think a lot of that comes back to what I had said earlier about this sort of ways of knowing and how different people come to know the world around them, and all of those pathways, and all of our students can represent many, many, many different ways of knowing, different strengths, different areas of aptitude. And I think that the more we understand that and then can recognize, here's ways of knowing that you connect with opportunities that are already there, but maybe can open a door to someone looking at something differently. I think so much of this is about perspective. And when we have a narrow door, it makes it very difficult for a lot of people to get through. And I think all of us have really advocated for a wide door for many people to access in many different ways and many different outcomes and outputs and all of the things that come with that. That if we don't have that very inclusive way of understanding and valuing all of the different ways of knowing, then we're continually limiting ourselves over and over again. I think that goes back to the systemic problems that we have. And it is very frightening hearing from faculty in different places where they're limited, what that actually means, because it means they can't get to a lot of people simply because someone doesn't agree with a way of thinking. And I think that's not very democratic.
Elie, I wanted to add something to what you've said, to what Jeffrey said about this, because our sentiment is very similar. But I want to make sure that we honor the person who asked the question, because the question that they posed are the ones that I think we're all struggling with ourselves, which is, where do we go from here? And what's been clear across the board for the three of us, we don't necessarily have the answer, but I want to draw on history here, and I want to draw on a public scholar who we all know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Let's not forget that he too was a scholar. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Boston University, but put that scholarship along with his theological training into action. So he's one of us, okay? And we've all heard this quote before, but it's worth repeating. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I will say to you, to all of us here on this panel, including back to myself, let us remember to do it anyway. When it just seems like, there's just nothing that we can do, their odds are against us, that there are so many constraints out there in the world, and perhaps my scholarship won't be recognized or the institution might not like it. If you haven't noticed, our world is on fire. We are in crises, moral, economic, equality, across all dimensions of human life. we've got to get in there. So my response to the person who asked the question in terms of like what to do it anyway.
Do it anyway and support those who are doing it, right? Don't support them just by giving applause and praise, but actually do things like, if they're working on something important, and if you have the resources, give them a center, give them staff, give them time, give them a collaborative team, give them the ability, for example, to hire other scholars into your institution, because they probably know best how institutional change has to happen. Enable cluster hires. Like there are ways to do it. You just have to be willing to mobilize the resources and never tell someone, look, we'd love for you to go off and do this, but do it alone. Thank you very much. That's how institutions don't change. That's how they set up people for burnout. One, I will say, and this goes back to Mellon Foundation too, because it's been transformative here. The Mellon Foundation funded here at ASU, we have the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, which I think now under the leadership of Ayanna Thompson is likely the only medieval Renaissance studies center in the US led by a Black woman who has a real social justice outreach to what she's doing. She's an expert in Shakespeare, but she started a movement called Race Before Race, which is really about looking back to the past, creating an engaged scholarly community, scholars of color who are out there to change fields positively, right? Not burn things down, but actually open up the welcome, build greater shelters for the next generation of scholars. And two things have made this possible. One, we have an institutional structure that we gave her that includes full staff, of beautiful space, everything that they need there. But also then the Mellon Foundation saying, we really like this mission, let's amplify it. Can you create a curriculum? Can you bring this into the world? Can you create impact? That seems to me the kinds of public scholarship that we really should be praising. It's collective, it's inspirational, and it changes how we think about the world.
That is a really great example. Ayanna's work is really like, it's scintillating and sparkly, and it just, you know, I don't study Shakespeare, but whenever she comes to the Huntington a lot, so there's a lot, like, we take advantage of this. But I think that's exactly spot on in terms of somebody doing the work, bringing the people together, and just doing it to help move it forward. I think that is so important. And knowing that you have allies, and you can have allies who are not public scholars who can still appreciate public scholarship. And I think that's also within a university setting, part of where some of the success can come, especially from the people who chair promotion and tenure committees, deans, and kind of on up into the administrative structures that have the capacity to help make those things happen and take a risk. Taking a risk is really the best way to move out there, and you know, sometimes not about taking no for an answer.
Each of you has mentioned some of the benefits of public scholarship, and I want to pivot to thinking about some of those, specifically in our relationship in the humanities to other disciplines. So, for example, Karita, you have really spoken to the way that students can feel engaged, a sense of belonging, a sense of being a part of something that matters as they are students. Jeffrey, you talked about the way that you think that that public scholarship is also the solution to the problem of the crisis of the humanities, that students in the humanities who engage in this kind of work will feel purpose and meaning behind the work that they do, and therefore be attracted to these fields. And Elie, you've really spoken about the ways that this work can find engagement, that in engagement, I should say, in places like museums, that students can feel a sense of, again, of purpose and also of application, of utility in this work. So thinking about that and about the way that the humanities benefit from public scholarship, is there a special role for the humanities in promoting public scholarship more broadly across the university? And I guess I'm asking, can we model for our colleagues in the social, natural, and physical sciences and engineering these kinds of practices in ways that they might benefit from? Or are there things we might learn from those who also seek co-production of knowledge, like doing public science. I mean, that phrase co-production of knowledge, Elie, in my world often comes out of my friends in applied ecology or in climate science, indigenous studies, folks who are working across those urgent social problems, but outside of the humanities. So that's a lot of stuff, but I guess I'm really asking, is there something special for the humanities in this project of public scholarship? Is this something we can find allies in the STEM fields with, or is this something that we need to show them how to do?
Probably both, honestly. One of the reasons I ended up at ASU is one of my best friends when I lived in Washington, D.C., is the planetary scientist, Lindy Elkins-Tanton. Lindy's in the news a lot right now because she's sending a probe to a metal asteroid called Psyche. Really, like, you know, she is the planetary scientist, brilliant person, but also my neighbor and friend in DC. And she left in order to take a job as director of the School of Earth and Space Exploration at ASU. And she and I were halfway through writing a book together. And the book is meant for all audiences. It's simply called Earth. And it's written as a discussion, sometimes letters, sometimes just a recording of a hike, of what it's like to think about the stakes of thinking about the whole planet, both from a humanistic and a planetary scientist point of view. And I got to know ASU by coming out to visit Lindy to finish the book. And here, everything you do has to be interdisciplinary. It's simply woven into the institution. So she and I have found that by modeling that kind of respectful dialogue with each other, where we both really listen to each other. Elie, you talked about curiosity. I think curiosity is like, if we can teach people to be exuberantly curious, that's it. That's really all we need to do. But by modeling curiosity about each other rather than trying to shut each other down, we're just hoping to perform what a truly collaborative take on a high stakes issue would look like. I think there's plenty of work out there to do. It's finding the sympathetic souls, the ones who are actually going to do that work with you. That can sometimes be a challenge because we don't have a good reward system. We're all busy, et cetera, but there are plenty of people that are willing to work with us. I don't think any discipline has it better than any other. They're sympathetic souls just across the constellation.
I think something that's interesting to me, I don't know where this fits into business or engineering or some of the other fields, but there's always this sort of concept of the grand challenges. I think those tend to be a little bit more science focused. But I think that they're a really interesting question to think about how humanities contribute to some of these larger contemporary issues. Climate change is a really great example, and finding people who are very interested in the humanities who can help understand and put context and perspective onto how we are, where we are, and where we might be going. I think there's, climate change is not solely the realm of science. It is, in fact, a human issue. And I think some of it is really looking at human issues and contemporary issues of humanity as ways that we're all contributing to understanding the world in different ways. And I think the Huntington is a really interesting place to do that because we are both botanical garden and research library and an art museum all kind of wrapped up together. And all of those things help you see different parts of the world from different perspectives all at the same time. And that opportunity is something that we can benefit from, assuming that we are able to recognize in the same way that with the grand challenges is always future focused. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe humanities can be more future focused rather than always thinking about preserving the past. It's very much about using the past to inform how the future is changed by what we do today.
I'll also say, as the social scientist in the room, I love my humanities brothers and sisters and non-binary LGBTQI folks. Always got to give the shout out. Why? Because I think, again, back to the coronavirus pandemic. What was one of the biggest lessons that came out of that? And we're still going through it now. We are all connected, every last one of us, every sentient being. And if we just apply that, that reality to how we think about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or non-disciplinarity, I cannot think of one topic or dimension of life that is exclusively history or exclusively English or exclusively sociology. There are intersections at every point, and they are not iterative. They are not compartmentalized. However, our limited human brains, we tend to go there and to like to put things in very neat categories and also put boundaries around ways of knowing, when in reality, there's so much that we should all be learning, but also integrating with one another through our different systems of knowledge. And I really like, this ecosystem language that's been become popularized in the last couple of years. It's really fruitful when you think of yourself as a part of an ecosystem. It then allows for more capacious imaginings of how we're contributing to a world of knowledge as opposed to a discipline.
One of our viewers offers this as a contribution that the sciences and other disciplines, I think including the social sciences, Karita, could offer the humanities that we might learn from, actually. They point out that external funding is often a necessity to engage in highly collaborative, public-facing humanities research. Yet humanities departments could learn something from the sciences and social sciences in terms of counting that kind of funding as a metric of success. And I think that's a fair point. To that, I might add that, as Elie pointed out earlier, scientists often, in fact, usually in most fields, have to work in collaboration, that they can't simply pretend to be unitary souls. And they're also, I think, I almost said much more better, excuse me. I'm thinking about my daughter now. They are effective, familiar with, and have also theorized, have actually thought about how to count multi-authored papers. Who's first author, who's second author, who's last author, what does that mean in each discipline? So I would add that those are things that we struggle with in the humanities, but really there are very good models, or at least there are multiple opportunities for us to learn from in other disciplines. And it puzzles me sometimes that humanists aren't willing or even realize that somewhere across campus is somebody who struggled with something different, struggled with the same problem and come up with a solution. Okay, we have another question in the, unless anybody wants to rebut that, I'd like to go to another question that's in the list I'm looking at from our audience. So this might even be a corollary. Are there specific communities or audiences that you have seen in your own work, who have seen reached with publicly engaged scholarship and outreach that may have created new connections or working relationships you'd like to share? Are there communities or audiences you have reached with publicly engaged scholarship or have seen others reach that may have created new connections or working relationships?
I can share two very different examples. One going back to that eCamp archive that I spoke about in the beginning of my remarks. As I mentioned, that was what's called a community-driven archive, meaning that you're working with a living population who is contributing materials to the archive and still yet living to witness that. So they are a part of the process, as opposed to an archive that accessions a collection from someone who's long since passed. Mm-hmm. That introduces all sorts of complications for that archivization process. And it also opens up a completely different set of possibilities in terms of collaborative opportunities. And I can tie this back to the funding conversation that we've been having as well. Mm-hmm. So one thing that happened with eCamp was the participants got really excited. Now you've got to think about this particular population. These are Black Appalachians, African Americans who all grew up in the same little coal towns, whose fathers were coal miners, all who had to move once this region was industrialized with machinery. Everybody had to leave. So they have been essentially erased from the history of that region, because very seldom do you hear anything about the contributions of African Americans to Appalachia, let alone Black folks from Appalachia. So you can imagine their excitement to hear there's going to be a book, there's an archive, people are interested in this topic. And they got really active at different levels in not only contributing to that archive, but wanting to be a part of those public conversations. So one thing that was so very good about my collaborators at the Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill was that they had the foresight to host a mini conference, and they invited 20 of the research participants, the early contributors to the eCamp archive. They got to come on site. We spent 3 days. They got to tour the archives, learn what the stacks were, what the accessioning process was, ask questions. That only ratcheted up and exponentialized the excitement about the archive, because those were our ambassadors and our biggest advocates and collaborators. So it really solidified that community word in the community-driven archives. They were not only, giving up their stuff, they were a part of the knowledge producing process. We, made sure to reach out in any publication that goes out about that community through that archive and what have you. So that's one example. But then there was a different externality that wasn't, directly a direct result of eCamp, but certainly, I think, a snowball effect of it. Brian Gemza, who was the director of the Southern Historical Collection at the time, hit me up one day and said, "Hey, we got to go to New York." And again, I'm still in grad school, and I'm like, I don't have $300 for a flight. So he's like, we're going to cover your flight. I need you to come to New York. We've got to go pitch the Mellon Foundation. We went to New York City and shared what we had been doing with this community-driven archive and 3 more cases that they wanted to onboard. But, archives need grants too. They need funding to build that kind of capacity. But we had, through eCamp, a proof of concept. We had proof that this can work, and how one financializes it at the beginning and what it would take to scale the model. Okay. And we were able to present that. And that resulted in an almost $1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation that went to the Southern Historical Collection. Dr. Gemza was good enough to put me as a co-PI on that grant. So another piece, and I like to be transparent to kind of dispel that Black girl magic myth that can sometimes be harmful. Part of what contributed to my later success with the outcome that I got with earning not only tenure, but full professor so quickly, was that I walked into my very first tenure track job out of being ABD with $1 million Mellon Foundation grant on my CV. Why did I get that? Because a colleague was good enough to count my contribution to what that institution was building, although that was not my scholarship. But they recognized that we're part of a beloved community. So sometimes it's that generosity of, could I publish this piece as a sole authored article or book or what have you? Sure, but I bet you most times we don't do that alone. Are there folks that we should be recognizing citing, or putting as co-authors, co-collaborators on the work because they were a part of that background process. So I'll stop at that example because I've gone over and cede to my colleagues.
But Karina, imagine if we worked in a culture of generosity like that all of the time, right? That's transformative, where you give matters so that it enables other things to happen over time. And I will say one thing I've seen that's a powerful spur to people feeling included and having community engagement, and definitely community archives. People totally get into it. One of the biggest projects we did here was Journal of the Plague Year. It was a collection of COVID stories, but we opened it up to the nation. All the trained archivists were our students, but they learned how to sort things, tag them, gather stories. People loved participating in that because it helped them to get around the COVID isolation that they were feeling. But if I may briefly tell one transformative story, ASU, we always work at scale. Everything matters about scale of impact. But honestly, for me, it's often about the personal. So there is, again, through the generosity of the Mellon Foundation, we have a couple of outreach programs or inclusion programs for our Native students, both of them in the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands, run by Natalie Diaz, Brian Brayboy, one on praxis of Indigenous mentorship. And somebody that I met through this program is a woman named Annie who grew up on the Gila River Indian Reservation. It's about 15 or 20 miles south of Phoenix. She's an online student. We don't distinguish between online and on ground here. They're both the same student community, and students can move in and out between the two. But Annie, when she became my mentor and was working in this program and thinking about the ways in which her studies in sustainability might be able to inform sustainability better if she brought her Indigenous perspective regarding foodways, et cetera, to them, stepped foot for campus for the first time as part of this mentoring program. And it struck me that, Annie, she's Akamel Otham, so this campus is built on her ancestral lands. And it took a mentoring program that is based on creation of public knowledge to get her to actually feel like she could step foot here. It was transformative for her. Now she's getting her master's degree in sustainability. But there's something about, though, the invitation to do public work and to have it valued that will transform a life. And transforming one life is, that's proof of concept. That's enough. But if we can get more than that, then all the better.
Elie, if you have anything else you'd like to add, you have the last word.
Oh gosh, that's hard. Just because I know we're running short on time, I think for me, one of the most important things is that the more you have a person with this mindset and these roles and working with students and including them, including communities, and working together collaboratively, giving access is the most important thing we can do, especially those people who have access to powerful structures of knowledge production. It's not outside of our realm of ability to say, I'm just going to put you on this. We're going to work on this together. You're going to have these types of things. I think that generosity is really essential to say, yes, you can come along. This is partly your work as much as it is mine, and that there's no, the ownership is different. It's a shared ownership. It's co-led, co-produced. And I think that is at the heart of why it matters. That's my final word.
Wow. Way to work in the heart of the matter into your final comment. What an extraordinary conversation this has been. I so appreciate the perspectives that the three of you have brought. And so I want to wrap up by thanking all of you. Thank you to our panelists, Karita Brown, Jeffrey Cohen, and Elie Wood, and to everyone who participated in today's conversation. I also want to thank the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Endowment for the Humanities, RTI International, the North Carolina Humanities, Research Triangle Park, the GlaxoSmithKline Foundation, North Carolina State University, the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, and the National Humanities Center's institutional sponsors who are supporting the spring series of events. You can join us for the next of them on Wednesday, March the 1st, when we'll be exploring humanistic dimensions of environmental advocacy with another wonderful group of panelists. You can find out more about that panel and other upcoming events on the center's website, nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Thank you again, everyone, and be well.